It's a pleasure to have you all here this evening for our director series of conversations. And as some of you have been to some of the conversations before, I really appreciate your coming back if that's the case, or first here. This one's a little different in the sense that a lot of these conversations I've done with artists and architects have been people I've really known for a very, very long time, been through the wars with, or in many cities and places. And I think the important thing also is, for me, is that LA is it is a new environment, and I'm very excited when I see all that's going on in this city with artists here. So tonight we're going to have a conversation with two artists, Edgar Arceneaux and Mario Ybarra Jr., who I haven't known for very long. I haven't known, I guess I met them since I got to Los Angeles, and talk about art-making practices and how they're changing, and loosely based on thinking about some of the things going on at the Watts Towers as one aspect of that. So first of all, I just want to thank the Director Circle for their support of the public programs here and their continuing support. And before I talk a little about the artists, I want to say something about, because it's been in the news, about Watts Towers and LACMA. You know, the Watts Towers are obviously one of the most important landmarks, I think, certainly in Los Angeles and the US and maybe in the world. And they have had this incredible history of being witness, first being made by Simon Rodia, and then being witness to a lot of history, and being an incredible inspiration. And the complexities, the problems, the achievements that surround this incredible symbol has always been a big draw for me personally. When I was going to school in San Diego, I would come up often to take friends and visit the towers and believe they were an incredible thing. And I know that they have inspired artists, you know, from John Outerbridge or other artists to even, I had a conversation once with James Turrell, who some of you may know is a Los Angeles artist who's been working for as long as Simon Rodia on a project called Rodent Crater, which is the conversion of a volcanic crater in Arizona. And he once said to me it was growing up in LA and seeing the towers and seeing that work, that commitment and persistent work that Simon Rodia put into those towers that made him believe he could embark on something that wasn't about just making an object in a short period of time, but that might be a kind of lifelong effort. But I personally have been inspired by those stories. And recently, you know, we all know that times are tough everywhere. The economic collapse has affected not only business and individual lives, but institutions of all kinds, large and small. This institution had to postpone large parts of its building programs, cut programs and staff. And we're all trying to reorganize. It's you know, not a secret that that's happening in communities, and a lot of headlines about LA City and budget cuts. And it was actually in that context recently that the city came to us about being a help potentially with the towers. And just to be clear, we did engage that. We have been engaging that conversation, and it's ongoing, about the possibility that LACMA could bring some of its expertise, energy, time, and effort to preserving the landmark, specifically the towers, because it seems they are so worth preserving, because as they've inspired others in the past, I'm particularly interested in who they will inspire in the future as well. And so all that's not concluded, but the idea is that we might be able to lend some of our time and effort, expertise, conservation, and otherwise to that effort over time. We'll see how that goes. I'd like to say that it's always in process. The idea is to involve, obviously, as many people as we can in that effort, community-wide, and I'm really looking forward to it. So to introduce our artists tonight, which many of you probably know, Edgar Arceneaux. He received his MFA from the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California in 2001, and he had many solo exhibitions, the Kitchen in New York, the Hammer Museum here, the Studio Museum in Harlem. It was he who helped found the Watts House Project, which is really an artist-driven enterprise that's going on now, but he obviously does work of all kinds and is involved in many artistic endeavors. He's also an artist that's represented in the collection. Mario Ybarra Jr. is somebody who's been categorized as contemporary art that is filtered through a Mexican-American experience in Los Angeles. And his work is hard to describe, but it certainly is all-encompassing, including environments, histories, narratives, fictional and actual. I saw his work when I first got to LACMA. It was included in the project that Barbara Kruger organized at the former May Company building, LACMA West here. And we'll show a slide of that and talk about that. And in 2002, Carla Diaz and Mario founded Slanguage, which is, as many of you know, an artist group headquartered in Wilmington, California, where the members make artwork, curate exhibitions, coordinate events, and lead art education workshops. I know from many, and he was featured in the exhibition Phantom Sightings, Art After the Chicano Movement, that I think a lot of you saw here at LACMA, curated by Rita Gonzalez along with Howard Fox and Sean Noriega here in Los Angeles, and that exhibition has traveled to Mexico. I think it's still in New York, and it's received incredible attention everywhere it's been. So that's been a great experience for all of us. I think artistic practices are constantly changing. People always like to say that everything's been done. Leonardo da Vinci said everything's been done, and then it's been said again and again in the 20th century that everything's been done, but we all know everything hasn't been done, and artists are continually tweaking and changing practices, helping us reconsider our values and working in different ways, and I think that's happening all the time. So part of tonight I hope to get out of our conversation is, you know, how are artists continuing to change how they look at practice and the world. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Edgar and Mario, and we'll have conversation.
Yeah, no, let's talk about this, because this was the project I found sort of right as I was coming to LACMA, and it was all, everything was a blur to me, and this project made it even more of a blur. Super complicated. This was in the May Company building, and I mean, my own impressions were, I just thought it was fantastic how you had created architecture within architecture. You had used, I mean, obviously there was graffiti. You had linked it to the building itself. I remember the writing on the paint on the columns, and I guess, and I do remember this so much, that you had built in these museum cases and taken things out of our pre-Columbian collection. So maybe you could say something about how you conceived this multifaceted project and how it also linked to the institution.
Well, yeah, again, hi everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. First of all, I'd want to kind of talk about this project, but there's some people that I just wanted to thank for being here that are definitely involved in this talk that aren't up here on stage. First, I'd like to thank all the other people that are involved with Slanguage Studio, all the artists that work with us, and the architects, Frank and Ravi, who have been really involved in this project. So just thanking them right out the bat, and also the family Garcia that we've been working with. But I wanted to kind of delve into a little bit with these three projects that I'm going to show you, my relationship to how I work within kind of institutional parameters, and kind of sneak in kind of communities or different types of communities or different types of histories into a larger kind of museum context. And this project was called the Belmont Ruins. For all of you who know or do not know, there used to be a place here just west of downtown called the Belmont Yard. The Belmont Yard, what it was an old subway station layup during LA's first red car line. It was the LA's first subway tunnel. It went for about a mile to the Pacific Electric building where Kohl's, the sandwich shop, is in downtown. And it went to this yard just by Belmont High School. In the 1980s, it had kind of been taken over and become one of the premier kind of graffiti yards in the city of Los Angeles. So this history from the 1980s up until the 2000s had like this layers and layers upon paintings and paintings. It had become like a de facto art school for Los Angeles graffiti artists. And then on top of that, it also had this other history of this pelota game that was brought up from Michoacan, in a state in Mexico. And this pre-Columbian game had been played for about 3,500 years and was being played every weekend in this field and just west of downtown LA. So there was this real continuum of kind of culture or prehistoric kind of pre-Columbian culture kind of happening in Los Angeles any given Saturday. That particular space was then bought by developers and now developed. So now it is supposedly a mixed income usage site where it has homes there, and one of the girls that actually works with us at Slanguage lives in these apartment condos that are there. So I decided that what I really wanted to do in the museum was to commemorate this space. So I worked with these 3 different communities. One was I went back and traced the original graffiti artist who had painted that site in the early 1980s, and it was a guy named Rick Crime and this other guy named Prime. And they were the first documented graffiti artists there who had painted the yard, but also worked with the ball game players, and this community of kind of transportation geeks, I want to call them, for lack of a better word, because they made this zine that was about every bus line and any kind of transportation line that had happened in the city. These guys made the zine that came out every week. So I got to work with these 3 different types of communities, along with the institution, along with LACMA. So within the LACMA permanent collection, it's also now here in the beautiful room that Jorge Pardo just designed with the pre-Columbian collection, this little ball court model from 250 BC from Nayarit. So we got to incorporate that into the actual architectural structure of this thing, along with things that were kind of found archaeology. Like when I was a kid, I wanted to be Indiana Jones or a psychic detective. So being able to, not being able to be either one of those things, and finding that art was the next closest thing to that, I was able to kind of go and collect items and artifacts from the yard, such as graffiti caps and spray paint cans, and bring them back to the museum. And it was a really interesting project because I worked kind of laterally throughout the museum with people deep in basements that had bow ties on, to like people up in the curatorial office. You don't have a bow tie on. But the people with bow ties kept telling me, like, why do you keep bringing this trash into the museum? And what it was kind of trash, but it was also these kind of archaeological artifacts from this yard. So we got to commemorate and make this kind of monument or unmonumental monument to this place. And I remember some writer wrote, I think in one of the magazines, that I had made a monument to a ruin that was in ruins, because at the end of the day, what we decided to do for the museum goers or people that were visiting the installation was to give them these big fat markers and allow them to kind of draw on the facade of this structure. So it was kind of related to the way that I first interacted with this graffiti art as a kid, 16-year-old kid, is that I went and spray painted on this space. And it was really kind of great to be able to have this kind of zone where you could kind of do that. And I wanted to kind of recreate that in the museum. So that's this project, the Belmont Ruins.
I remember seeing this project, and I was so impressed about how it met with some of the ideas I was thinking about how you take these old, ancient objects, things in the museum, and our job as curators is to bring them alive and to make them relevant to the present. And I think that what I loved about the project is how you as an artist could recontextualize, reconsider, take something from outside the museum, outside the place, another time, and then even having people working in the space. Because I think a little bit about what the museum is, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a little bit of time travel too.
Yeah. For me, being this was my first museum exhibition. So I was trying to work on all kinds of levels, and it was a long time kind of planning this exhibition. And for example, we brought in these graffiti artists to paint inside the museum. And I remember during the installation, we had a while to install, and I somehow wrangled like 5-man lists from all the different departments and all the different parts of the museum with bagel and donut bribes and all this kind of stuff, and bringing them inside. And then I remember the next day, the security guard was telling somebody, oh, those contractors that Mario had in here were drinking and smoking in the museum. And I was like, no, those weren't contractors. Those were the graffiti artists that were that were painting this thing. So to be able to bring in these groups that were definitely kind of important and definitely shaped the subject matter of this work, but we're also kind of the living monuments to this space. Yeah. So being able to have them come in and have them also be part of the exhibit, where like the project, my name was on the wall at certain points, but their names were on all the kind of placages and signage and all the stuff that kind of happened. So being able to kind of bridge those 3 communities that dealt with this particular space into the museum, for me, was a fun thing to do.
And I think it was felt in the museum too. I mean, one of the themes, as is usually the case with artists who are successful as young artists in LA, and then they get picked up and appreciated in other places like Europe. You were quickly invited to do projects, in this case in London. This is the Serpentine Gallery, and I'm really interested in how you both are working inside and outside, drawing the outside inside, and then making the museum a place of activity rather than a place of static presentation. So maybe you can say something about how the bird...
Well, this is a project that both Carla Diaz, my wife, and I did at the Serpentine Gallery in London. And the way that this project came about was I live and grew up in Wilmington, California, and I live by this park called Banning Park. And it's one of the last green spaces before the Long Beach River lets out into the Pacific Ocean. So it has fresh water outlet to the ocean there. And because it's one of these last green spaces, a lot of birds kind of hang out in the park on their migratory patterns. I didn't know this. Nobody ever told me this growing up. But me and my wife have 3 little weenie dogs, and we'd go for walks in the park. And we see these weirdos with binoculars. And I was like, what are you looking for? You know, like, you see people with binoculars in my neck of the woods. They're usually the cops or insurance investigators or something like that. I don't know what they're doing. So I'm like, what are you looking for? And they're like, a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And I'd be like, what? Thick-lipped kingbird. And I'd be like, what? So the neighborhood that they have this park in also has a historic overlay area, and it has these feral peacocks that live in that neighborhood. So Carla and I were like, wow, we should start a bird watching club, in our neighborhood. That would be fun, since these people come from all over the world to already stop in our park to look at these birds. Maybe we should, take interest in that in ourselves. So I was part of this exhibition called The Uncertain States of America. Actually, both Edgar and I were part of this exhibition, is where we met each other. And it was this exhibition that toured all throughout Europe. These curators collected these artists from our generation, from all over the States, and took us on this tour of Europe. But this particular instance, at the Serpentine Gallery, when they called me on a Thursday and they said, Mario, we need you to come up and think of a new project for the Serpentine, because the first project you did is going somewhere else. So I went the next week, and when they took me to the museum, I walked in the first room super excited, like, oh, is this my room? Big white room, and things that we're always kind of wanting to be in. And the curator was like, no, next room. We went into the next room. No, is this my room? No. After 3 or 4 times of this, we were outside the museum. We had gone out the back door of the museum, and I was like, wow, there's no more rooms here. There are no more rooms here. And I remembered that when I was a kid, my grandmother had this saying that when one of us thought we were too cool, that the peacock didn't see its own ass. That the peacock has these big, beautiful feathers. Then it turns around, and then there's papers hanging off of it and all this kind of stuff. And essentially, they had given me the ass end of the museum to work with. So I was like, what a place. So we decided to call it, and the museum was in Kensington Gardens, which is the beautiful, gardens of some queen or other, and Princess Diana has her monument there, and Peter Pan was supposed to have been written about in this place. So I was like, oh my God, like, this is the perfect place to start our bird club, at the ass end of this museum that faces the park. Not unlike LACMA, you guys have a park in the back. So we were like, oh my God, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna found this birdwatching club. So we called this project Operation Birdwatch London. The peacock doesn't see its own ass. Let's twitch again. And twitching is like this extreme sport version of bird watching, where people kind of go nuts about things. But what we did was, what the project ended up entailing was, we worked with the education department of the Serpentine, and we worked with 5 young artists that had been going through their education department and growing through with them. And we were numbers 1 through number 7 of this bird watching club. And we joined the Royal Society for Preservation of Birds. We took this park ranger gave us a tour of the park and showed us how there are these 2 types of predatory birds in central London, the tawny owl and the peregrine falcon. And these 2 peregrine falcon were nesting on the Tate Modern Tower. So all this stuff, right? And what ended up happening is we along with these numbers 1 through 7, developed this installation. So
I had no idea you had such a background in bird knowledge.
Me neither. So we developed this whole installation that we borrowed specimens from the Natural History Museum. We went on these bird watching excursions. We collected these bird watching things. We had a bird whistle concerto at the opening. And that was the kind of the week leading up to the exhibition, or the opening. Then during the exhibition, which lasted about a month or so, people were invited to kind of join our bird club. For £1, they got a button and this kind of activities poster, and they were signed into this registry and became members of our club. So over the next month, we had 289 members join our bird club in London. And people like little kids, 9-year-olds, to people like Yoko Ono joined our birdwatching club. And this is a really funny project, and it was about kind of us exploring and us about learning at the same time. Like, we didn't necessarily have an expertise in birdwatching, I'd seen the Orson Welles films, Fake, and we know that experts are, I don't know, you know what I mean?
Well,
But that's what we did.
I remember going to a collector's storage unit when I was in Cologne a few years ago. And though you may not think of yourself as Indiana Jones, the experience that I'm going to tell you about reminds me of it, because I wound up climbing up the stairs of what I thought was one compartment of wooden boxes. And when I stood up on the top shelf, I looked into the distance, and it looked like the very end of the first Indiana Jones, where there was box after box after box. And I remember him saying to me, I want you to get over the romanticism of what it is to be an artist. I want you to see what happens to your work after we buy it. So, it just kind of gets categorized in that way.
Yeah.
So on the tail end,
Yeah.
you're winding
So-
up in the
So
realm
on
of,
the tail end, this project was really important for us because Carla and I were kind of bringing these kind of pedagogical approaches outside of our studio in Wilmington and bringing them, kind of putting them on the road and kind of field testing them. And this one was pretty successful in that Jessica Morgan, who is a contemporary curator at the Tate Modern, during the end of that year, 2006, gave us her #1 pick in her top 10 and the best of issue of Art Forum. So like being able to like transcend like the kind of localized space or where we were initially from or where we initially thought this project could kind of happen in Wilmington at our local park, the idea did transcend to this other place that we didn't necessarily know about initially,
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I appreciated about this particular project, and I remember seeing this when we were in, you should know that this show has traveled probably around the world. It might still be going, I don't even know where it is, honestly. But this particular project, I remember seeing it when we were in New York at Bard, and I walked past it and I said to myself, what is that? And like, whose work is it? And like, why is it in that glass room or over in the corner, wherever it was? And when I found out that it was this collaboration with the education program, what I realized is that it had tweaked my understanding of how art could exist within the exhibition space. And then I was completely disoriented by exactly where Mario's presence ended and where these other participants began. And I remember that of the 50 artists I think that were in this show, this was one of the things that stuck with me. That you were able to carve out this space in which you and your practice can actually integrate itself into the one program within the confines of the museum, which generally, outside of LACMA, of course, which is generally sort of seen as like the stepchild to the regular programming, is the education programming.
Right.
And like that's for the kids or that's for the other folks. But
And for us, it was really important because it was like our Richie Valens, like La Bamba moment. Like, we were on the radio. We had our #1 hit. Richie, oh wow, we're in Art Forum. Oh my God, and we got a #1 hit. It was like our, I thought we were going to be on American Bandstand or Soul Train or something. So it was an interesting moment.
Those aren't on the air.
You're saying it with a beautiful sense of humor and how you engaged all of this and what you were doing. But of course, as an art historian, I can refer to other. It's easy to think of Marcel Broodhurst, the great Belgian artist, and his Department of Eagles, the space where he created a kind of comment on museums with his sort of eagles that were existing as a collection in the museum. But the distinction, of course, between that gesture and yours is how yours is into the community. You're not afraid to just take people off the street or in the park, and I see this as a fundamental shift in artistic practice where it's high art. It's juggling the ideas of the definitions of art to move inside and outside the galleries, to drag others into it, to have process. Like that's not.
Yeah, you could, if you go to the next one, Mike, I could tell you specifically how I drug somebody from this project into the next project.
Also, this is also in
the
London.
and the images before there, there were a bunch of images on the wall, and one of them was of a guy named Daniel. And Daniel had this interesting hairdo that looked like a bird nest. And one of the bird watching members were like, "Oh, let's take a picture of his head. It looks like a bird nest." But she was afraid to take the picture, so I asked him, "Hey, can I take your photograph?" And he was like, "Why? Are you a hairdresser?" And I said, "No, but I have a barbershop." And at that time, Carla and I were running a barbershop that we had kind of I guess, inherited from this woman, Annie Shaw, in Chinatown, and we were running projects out of them. And I go, no, but I have a barbershop. It's a Chinatown. So we became friends, and he goes, well, I'm a barber. And then this guy, Daniel, ended up having one of the premier barbershops in Soho that was very connected to the art world. So the next year, I go, well, I had found out by then that the next year I'd be coming back to London to do this project at the Tate Modern, where we recreated our barbershop inside the museum. And our barbershop in Chinatown, we ran artist projects out of, but we had left like a kind of look like a barbershop. So people would come in from the neighborhood, and they'd say, hey, can we get a haircut? And I'd be like, no, but you can look at these drawings or whatever was up. You know? And then we'd have these conversations. And some of them were really interesting because they had been guys that had gotten their haircut when they were young guys, and now they're old guys, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I decided that I wanted to kind of put this project on its head, and that here, the show was called The World as a Stage, and the premise of the curators were to have our artists kind of come into the museum and to use kind of tropes of theatrics and acting and staging and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, the Tate Modern is just a little bit down from this place called the London Dungeon, which is like this kind of tourist trap place that takes you through all the catastrophic events that have happened in London in the past 1,000 years or whatever. And one of their displays is on the Sweeney Todd barbershop, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, you know. So I had somehow got lost when on one of my meetings, ended up on this tour where these kids dressed up like, they're like college kids dressed up as, I don't know, Jack the Ripper or whatever, take you through this demon barbershop. And I was like, wow, I have this barbershop back home. Maybe we could play on this kind of thematic or this kind of theme of like Sweeney Todd and this kind of theatrics, this Stephen Sondheim film, play, musical. And maybe we could do this thing called the Sweeney Tate. So this project is called the Sweeney Tate, and we kind of rebuilt our barbershop inside the museum. And I don't have images of them to show you right now, but we held an international barber competition inside the museum, and we had a barber from Milan, a barber from London, Daniel, who I just told you, and my barber back from Wilmington here flew him out to cut hair. We had this whole kind of performative days of cutting hair inside the museum. So being able to kind of switch around again, like this idea of like this barbershop that shows art and then this art that cuts hair, you know, and of course they're like, was what I really wanted to kind of play with, and and really kind of playing with the idea of like being able to take this thing from my life, because it was a barbershop that we were kind of, Carla and I were doing programming in Chinatown, and then also kind of tipping my hat to like artists that have come before me, like people like Pippo Osorio, who had done this amazing barbershop piece, and being able to kind of play with all these kind of ideas of art history and where that intersects with my life, and where that intersects with theatrics, and then bring it to the museum.
Yeah.
And that's this piece.
I can bring up dozens of art historical references to this, ranging from Smithson's sites, non-sites, and thinking about the museum and inside and outside, as well as Sweeney Todd, Sweeney Tate. But again, the difference is, for me, is those are more formal experiments, expressions in form, and you're engaged in this actual real-life exchange, and bringing the barbershop in, bringing the barbers in, having the art shows outside the institution. And I guess it's the thing I'm learning from as I watch. I'm always learning from artists, and I'm learning from artistic practice, but the inside-outside the museum thing is I think very important, that we've come to understand that the museum is just kind of a permeable membrane for what activities take place in art. And I know that even that extends to thinking even about the process of art, right? Collaboration, just to say you have your team.
Since 2002, Carla and myself, and initially another artist, Juan Capistran, we founded this place called Slanguage Studio. It's at 640 Avalon in Wilmington, California. I grew up in Wilmington, so when growing up, there wasn't really any kind of art, nothing going on there other than me having to drive to the Belmont to go spray paint. So like being able to like come home and have my studio back home was really important to me. And when we initially rented this storefront, which it's a storefront, it used to be an old bakery called La Guadalupana Bakery. It's about 1,500 square feet. It's not very big. But when we rented this storefront, initially I wanted it to be my place where I could make stuff at, And that wasn't our initial intent. But there was such a need for a space for young artists. Particularly at that time, they were like young adults, about 18 to 25, to like come and hang out with each other, make work together, that we just kind of facilitated that. So people would come in, oh, Mario, I want to draw. Well, here's paper, go to that corner. Oh, Mario, I want to paint. Well, here's a canvas, go to that corner. Oh, Mario, I want to DJ. Okay, here's a plug yourself in there and DJ. And so there was this kind of facilitation that my practice for a few years at the beginning became about just this kind of facilitating these artists' young art practice. So at the point where curators would come in, like say Rita would come to visit me or somebody else would come to visit me, and they'd be like, oh, Mario, what are you working on? And they look around at the walls and expect to see some kind of photograph or a video of some performance I did or something. And I'd have to explain to them, well, you're breathing in it. Like this space and organizing this space has become my practice, and that's the work. Like being able to do this is the work. And that kind of led into a lot of different things. We've run, children's workshops there. We've run an exhibitions program there, and we're talking about 1,500 square feet. It's not big at all. But being able to facilitate that along with Carla and kind of build a kind of community around what it is that we do, to where my studio, if I go there today, I'm not in there by myself. There's always some kind of thing happening, or some kind of, like, I told Carly the other day that we needed to set up a 1-800 like hotline number, because we're always getting these phone calls from different artists and people and historians and curators, and it's like work, about collaborating with them, but also it's also about maybe some kind of crisis they're going through.
I know one thing that we said we were going to talk about at some point was the nature of your organization. And how you guys support yourselves. I don't know if you want to mention anything.
Yeah, well,
about
one of the things that one of the things that we've kind of tried to set up for ourselves from the beginning is that we've been there since 2002, and we are not a nonprofit organization. We've kind of grew up being around nonprofit organizations. We had these amazing mentors when we were young. This man, Manasad Gamboa and Dixie Swift, they had this center in Long Beach called the Homeland Cultural Arts Center. And it was amazing for both Carla and I to kind of grow up in that environment. But then we also saw that there were these kind of difficulties running a kind of small nonprofit in a neighborhood. Either they would get consumed by bigger entities or blah, 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 and their mission would kind of always get shifted. So we were always trying to figure out for ourselves how we could set up some kind of entrepreneurial or business model for kind of staying alive. And that has kind of led to, I'm not saying that we do that at 1,000% either, but like at least we're right now we're in the process of trying to figure that out. So the things, when we approach things, we try to approach it as like a kind of, when we're doing take-on projects, which I think kind of delineates us from what a traditional nonprofit would do in terms of seeking, grant funding and stuff like that, is that we've been taking on art projects and things like that on a kind of contractual basis to get money, and then I've kind of deal with commercial galleries that I work with and around the country and around Europe, that when we sell things, the money that kind of I make with my practice kind of goes back into supporting what we do at Slanguage. So it's not a traditional model of what has been set up, I think, by traditional nonprofits. So it doesn't completely work. I don't know if it completely works either, but it's just trying to figure it out too, just because I think we are wanting to kind of stay focused on what our mission is, which is to kind of keep an active kind of insightful and be active and keep insightful and be kind of producing and in accordance to what it is that we want to produce, as opposed to this funding source comes here, so we shift 90-degree angle to
right.
appease that. So it's been a rocky road, but it is something that I think has been what we're trying to create.
Yeah, I mean, I see these models shifting. Again, the theme, I think, is that how these models keep shifting. I mean, you said a few things, including that, your work used to be that the artists got the day job so that they could make work so it would go to the galleries. And now I see a lot of artists that are, putting work in galleries to make money so they can fund their practice, which is really more collaborative and more in the real world. Yeah. And there's a lot of shifts happening. Obviously, you're becoming a bit of a business leader in your own mini sense, right? You've got all these people you're creating opportunities for, and then I guess you've got, Edgar then is serving as a curator. He's an artist, but then he starts serving as a
Yeah,
curator.
I don't think of myself as a curator.
Well,
I
you're
wouldn't
picking-
characterize it as,
All right.
as curation.
Well, you
yeah.
can talk about that because it's
Sure.
it's a bending of definitions then, because you're seeing it as your artistic practice, but then you're
Yeah.
picking on Mario to
Picking on him. Yeah, that's probably a good way to
work
put
on
it.
projects
Yeah.
you're working on, right? What? What's the
There's one thing that I think that we share, which is there's a our relationship with institutions is about figuring out ways of bending economies or tweaking economies so that the reputation that Mario has is a way for him to leverage both art as an economic engine for the organization himself, because as a conduit, he can do that in a way in which perhaps other people within Slanguage could not, at least not at this point. But I think that through their proximity to you and them sort of learning in the process of your relationship to institutions, that it would then sort of spread across so that they could then also establish relationships with institutions
and
as
we've been
well.
able to do that on a few different levels. Like we just last fall, Slanguage just did a residency with MoCA, and we were able to kind of I guess for lack of a better terminology, have this like lateral growth as an organization, like with all the different members in relationship to the institution, because we did things like performances, and we had these teenage breakdancers that we sponsor. They're called the Dub City Tribe, come in and perform at MoCA. So now, to a certain extent, they've kind of have that as a feather in their cap, like, oh, they performed at MoCA, where we know a bunch of people that would want to perform at MoCA or something like that. So being able to be able to have that leverage, as you kind of termed it, is good. But I think that's also what I learned from mentors that I had kind of growing up. For example, this guy Manasad Gamboa, who was a poet and playwright, he's the guy that wrote this book called Memories of a Bulldozed Barrio, and it talks about him growing up in Chavez Ravine, and he used to get all these different readings around town. I remember as a young person reading in Lamert Park and reading in the theater center in downtown and all these different places as a kind of opening act for Manasad. So I remember it was kind of like how we were kind of trained in terms of like this kind of, for lack of a better word, like a kind of baton passing or kind of a lineage within the city. Because I remember when at Santa Monica, I remember one of the most important places for reading kind of poetry was this Midnight Special bookstore. It was this really cool bookstore, and I remember as a kid, I don't know, like 20 years old or something like that, we would go and do these opening acts for Manasad, and it was really important, because now that I see who we were able to meet at that point as young people inside like Midnight Special bookstore, which is no longer there no more, and seeing like how important these people were to culture and to literature, it was like, wow, I didn't even know that was where I was. I didn't even understand the context that Manasad was putting me in. Now I kind of can get it, but at that point I was just happy to be around,
You're doing a residency with LACMA, I know, and it was just going to result in an exhibition called Possible Worlds,
Yes.
which is going to involve that. Here's you, I guess this is interviews with
Yeah.
the Garcia family. That's
Yeah.
part of that.
Yeah.
So this is Project Upcoming, which I
Yeah,
assume will
so-
have the same inside-outside theme.
Yeah, so what we're doing now, and why we're kind of here on the stage together with Michael and Edgar, is again, Rita was able to ask me if I wanted to be involved with Watts House Project and take on this project. But I thought initially, as an individual artist, that wasn't something that I felt I wanted to do by myself, or was even appropriate for me to do by myself. So I pitched that, Slanguage and Slanguage Studio, meaning all the kind of levels of artists and young artists that we work with, would kind of take on this project as a kind of family. And what we are now partnering with Watts House Project, and also partnering with Frank and Ravi, and this family, the Garcia family. And when Frank and Ravi and I...
And that's Frank and Ravi of Escher Gunwardner Architecture, who's these two guys sitting here.
When we first met to kind of discuss how we wanted to approach this project, one of the things was that we really felt that it was important for us to get to know the Garcia family, and we really wanted to kind of do these interviewing sessions with them. So we would go on these kind of field trips and visit the family. And what you're looking at are two images here of us kind of data pulling or data mining the family, because we really felt that when we were we're going to do this project, which is going to be a long-term project, this isn't something that we're just going to happen in a month, or like that birdwatching project that they told me called me on Thursday. I showed up on Monday. A month later, we had this project already. This is something that is going to be what we've come to all understand now, a deeply entrenched project, and that it's only going to have a kind of cultural or enrichment for the neighborhood, and most importantly, for the Garcia family, is if we thoroughly understand the space and understand them as a family and what's kind of going on there. So we've been doing going through this interview process with them. And what we hope to kind of do during these interviews, or what we hope to get out of them, are kind of what we're kind of calling our cornerstone ideas that will then get interpolated into some type of design work, some kind of layout, architectural, adding on to the house, and also dealing with some really important infrastructural stuff that the house has. Right. There are things that we didn't know. Kind of just thinking as an artist, I think it's been really important in relationship to collaborating with the architects, is that our first intent was to we want to put stuff on the fence and we want to decorate it, And then the architects are like, well, no, we have to really figure out if this underneath the house is okay. And we're like, underneath the house, nobody sees that. but we've had to come to terms with these real ethical and moral kind of concerns that are really important for the Garcia family and their residents and their well-being.
And can I add something to that? I mean, part of the balance that we realize that we need to take, and I know we haven't talked about Watts House Project as a whole, which we will get to, but this investigation, this exploration that Mario finds himself going through with Frank and Robbie and the family, is one in which we realize that aesthetic improvements aren't enough by themselves, but that at the end of the day, what we really want to make sure that we're doing is instilling real value into the home. So we've come up with a ratio of investment versus the current value of the property to make sure that it doesn't exceed 40%, so that when you invest back into it, it doesn't have a ripple effect or a disproportionate effect on the property value and then on their taxes. Because if you don't take those things into consideration, these very real sort of pragmatic concerns, then it can result in displacement or gentrification. And those are the things that we're considering on sort of a big picture level, but they're figuring out how to negotiate that directly on the ground. Since we have a limited amount of resources, then they have to figure out aesthetic versus real practical value investment. What does improvement actually mean? What does aesthetic intervention actually mean? What does that look like, or what does it do? I think are some of the bigger questions that we're wrestling with.
So maybe we should get to that. So, because Edgar, I want to talk about your practice and how you've come to it. Maybe as a segue, I think I got as a segue, just as almost a moment of silence, just a few fantastic photographs by Joe Farb Hernandez of Watts Towers, this monumental, incredible thing, this object that's so strange and so beautiful, which I guess was the house also for a while when Simon Rodia lived there. As I said, it's amazing to me how it continues to inspire so many people to this day, and has been witness to so many events in LA. And I think we've all been drawn to that particular example. So Watts House Project it's also not a conventional artwork by museum standards where you make an object in the studio and bring it to the museum. Edgar, you've sort of defined your practice in many ways. Obviously, you do drawings and objects that we do have as part of our collection. But, you were quoted once as saying, the work we're doing in Watts is normally bracketed within a community service dialogue. You felt that as a concept severely limits the work you're doing, and that something you've tried to do at the site is focus on the creative act, the creativity of being engaged in the situation in a really creative way, and not just on results. I think that's something, you've said. So tell us a little about how you came to this. I know there's a little history here, but how you conceive of your practice in relation to this thing called Watts House
Watts
Project.
House Project. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about my involvement because it's been since 1996 when I first got involved with the WHP. And first I wanted to say thank you to everyone who came today, to acknowledge that there's a great number of constituents here from the Watchtowers Art Center, which is fantastic. Some of the Friends groups are here. Also, our artists and architects have shown up. Our board of directors, our staff from the WHP, residents are scattered about. Hey everybody, thanks for showing up, and making it through all that traffic. My involvement with the Watts House Project began back in 1996 when I did a studio visit with John Outerbridge, who was a mentor of mine. And I remember him saying to me, well, you could come over, but there's this artist from Houston here who wants to talk to me about this project. So I said, okay, well, that's fine. So I went there to show him my thesis project that I was working on at Art Center at the time. And when I met Rick, he said, well, let me tell you what I'm working on. I'm trying to get artists together to work on this project down, and I'm not sure of the location yet at the time. And I said, well, let me show you what I'm doing. And at the end of the conversation, I said, well, this sounds amazing. Whatever you decide to do, I would love to be involved. And he said, okay, well, I'm coming back to LA in 3 months. I'll call you. Now I was, in my undergrad studies, I was maybe 24 at the time. And I was like, he's not going to call me. But 3 months later, he called me. He came to Art Center, met me in the cafeteria, and said, of the 15 or 20 artists that I talked to about being involved with this project, you were the only one who took any interest. So why don't you come and join me? It was part of an exhibition at MoCA called Uncommon Sense that Julie Lazar and Tom Finkelpearl had curated. And it became a collaboration eventually between Rick, Mark Greenfield, who was at the Watchtowers Art Center at the time, and one of the residents, Felix Madrigal. And that was basically the beginning of my relationship with the WHP. I've been involved with the Watts House Project as long as I've had exhibitions, so I've been showing, I don't even know what professionally means, but since 1997, and these two things have always run parallel with each other as tracks. In Rick's original incarnation of the Watts House Project, it was meant to be primarily facade improvement, and he saw it as something which was analogous to the Cultural Crescent Master Plan, which was created by the Community Redevelopment Agency in 1968, 3 years after the uprising in Watts of 1965. And the Cultural Crescent was meant to be both an education, entertainment, and economic stimulus to the area. But the plan was so big, it was so bloated that up until maybe 10 or 12 years ago, like the first parts of that plan was actually implemented. And one of the things after looking through this dense book that we realized was that though this was affecting a lot of the public land that existed there in the Watchtowers neighborhood, it did not directly affect the residents themselves to any benefit. And we saw ourselves as being able to operate as a bridge or a conduit through a kind of a synergy between what the city was doing and their investments, and then how we could parallel that with the families themselves. But like all projects, all art projects, they eventually have to reinvent themselves and be built upon the principles that were laid out before them. And in 1999, Rick was no longer able to manage the Watts House Project. He had to go back to Houston, back to Project Row Houses, which had gone from being a relatively small-scale organization to a large one in a pretty quick period of time, and basically had to retreat. I stepped in and got involved, and then we did our very first projects on the site back in 1999. Since then, in the last 3 years, we've actually reimagined it and broadened it in scope, just simply because the conditions of the neighborhood had changed. So the Watts House Project we describe as a ongoing collaborative artwork in the shape of a neighborhood redevelopment. Artists and architects and residents working together to imagine changes to the interior, exterior, front yard, and backyard of the homes on East 107th Street, right across the street from the Watchtowers and the Watchtowers Art Center. The foundation of the WHP is this renovation phase, which is this collaboration, again, between an artist and an architect and the residents to imagine these changes each family has their own team, and the ultimate sort of direction and flow is really meant to be dictated by the dialogue between that family and the artists and designers. But from there, we realized that unless we deal with some of the larger issues, that these levels of investment that we're trying to make, which again, I said was somewhere around 40% of the value of the home, that it incentivizes speculators to come in and then start to produce the seeds for displacement. So listening to Felix, Felix Madrigal, who lives at 1762, over the last decade or so, and then the other families like Hanaro, who's in the back, or Monique, or Rosa, who were here, we realized that there were many other desires which were connected to this Watchtowers neighborhood that needed to be addressed as well, because it was at this point, and like Mario in our relationship to LACMA, we realized that the arts could be a viable economic engine if it's situated in a way in which the object is dematerialized and it becomes about the activity being projected upon things. And those things need not be something which one could recognize as an artwork, but that is just simply within the realm of the process, and the negotiation is where sort of the beauty comes from. This as an idea, for me, was freeing in a way, because it was at that point that it didn't simply mean that it was just the house that could be affected, but that maybe it could be a procedure or an approach or a relationship that could be sort of aesthetically understood too. These other programs, which right now, most of these were far more ambitious than I realized to happen, but the Artist in Residency right now has been ongoing for the last 2 years, and currently we're working with 4 families. And those projects are within the pre-planning and design stage, but in total, we're looking at 8 structures that are on the block. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, that's not a very big image, I don't think. So these are our 4 projects here. We have the Madrigal House, which the great thing about the families that are owners on the block is that they've been there for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. In regards to the Pachado family, they've been there more than 50 years. So they're really rooted and help to stabilize the neighborhood. But the rental properties are ones which continually flip. And again, speculators investing, flipping, investing, and flipping. So the Madrigal House here, the Love House, which is next door, which is Alexander Grant and Roberto Scheinberg. And this is a local architect by the name of Stephen Slaughter, who's working with the Madrigal family, and artist Tanya Aguillanega and Ed Pine Stevens and Amy Devers. We had the platform, which we were fortunate enough to be able to purchase 3 homes last summer. And these are really, really, in my mind, some of the most special properties on the block. They were actually built by the Burnett family in the early 1900s, who had migrated there from the South. In a similar way that my own family had migrated to Los Angeles, my grandfather came to LA in 1923 from Greensboro, Mississippi. And like the Burnett family, he was able to buy his own home, raise 5 children, and he was a self-taught painter and an inventor, but my grandfather only had a 6th grade education. So if you can imagine trying to raise 5 kids today with a 6th grade education, either you're going to have to be living by some illicit means, or be on the county, or maybe you have to move out to Palmdale or something like that. It would be impossible, more or less, to be able to live that dream. But in a lot of ways, my grandfather's experience of family and home and the arts and a real inventiveness is sort of it's become the scaffolding, in my mind, of the WHP today. And then we have the Garcia project, which is the one that Mario and Slanguage and Carla is working on with Frank and Ravi. And maybe at some point during the conversation today, you guys may step in with that. So this is our block here. And again, I wanted to recognize that Rosie Lee Hooks is here, who's the director of the Watchtowers Art Center, which is up here in the upper left, and the Mingus Art Center. And we hope in the future to be able to partner with them and our programming that we're doing there on the site. Why don't we go to the next slide? I'm just going to talk about these briefly, and I don't think that we can actually see the driveway here, but in my experiences and working with the families, oftentimes when things go a certain way, I find myself deriving principles from processes that just seem to work just right. So when Felix and I first started working on a project together in 1999, and it's difficult to see the driveway here, as we were talking about some of the needs of the family, he said, you know, my driveway is unpaved, and for more than 10 years now, I've been ticketed in my own driveway because it's an unpaved surface. But also, he's not allowed to park in front of his own house because of restricted parking. And I was like, you literally have paid thousands of dollars in parking tickets since you lived here? And it was just incredible to me. And like, these are like $60 tickets. This isn't even like an average $25 ticket. So working together, we designed the driveway, and then working with local resources, which were friends of his, we were able to do the project at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time. And what I derived from this experience was that the aesthetics of the Watts House project need to extend from the real pragmatic needs of the place. So it's not this idea of a kind of top-down aesthetic approach where you come in and say, I know what something should look like, and then you have it conform to that, but that is something that would be born from the dialogue itself. So this is the backyard, and we can skip to the next. So this is a shed in the back, and we wound up knocking down the one that was there and rebuilding it. It was actually built in the early 1920s, I believe. It was amazing. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the soil in Watts on 107th Street, but it's actually some of the most fertile stuff you could imagine. So when we knocked down the shed and then we had to put a footing underneath, we literally had to dig down like 6 feet underground because it was so sandy. But in the process, like, we found like a Model T tire, like old milk bottles, old shoes and stuff. And I remember thinking, this is amazing. You know, I tried to collect all these things. And then a couple months later, I had a conversation with Mrs. Pachado, and she was like, yeah, you know, when polio was going around, if somebody got stricken with that, they would take your clothes and bury them in the backyard. And I was thinking, oh my God, like, did we just find some diseased stuff that have been buried underground for the last 100 years? So this shed was built in the back through a conversation with the architect and with Felix, and then the patio is meant to serve as a dual function, as a place for the family to hang out, but also serves as storage for them because they have no garage. And this is one of the ideas of how it'll look, and eventually is to turn it into a nice patio, except Felix decided he didn't want the wooden deck. He said, you know, I'm a simple man, I don't want to have to sand it and varnish it, put cement. I was like, Felix, but this is the 21st century, man. You know, they're trying to discourage people from using cement anymore, but you can see the result. And then here we are with Frank and Ravi and Junior at the Garcia house. In their first meeting, just starting to talk about what some of the needs are and then assessing. And then from there, that the choices and the decisions to be made, because you guys are still in the design phase right now, are still sort of need to be articulated.
So you know, like, it's really, I find so many interesting things again about that practice, and how, you know, you want to keep it in the realm of art and creativity, because that's the whole idea, to extend human creativity, because that's at the base of all problem solving, I think, in the end, and that's what we need to keep pushing. Obviously, you're up against pragmatic problems like driveways and tickets. I heard that story, and I was so impressed with the practical needs and the issues. And you are working inside and outside the institution. So, I mean, now you're working together. I assume that there's both an incredible beauty in this practice and satisfaction. I also understand there must be frustrations all the time, whether it's raising money, which I've heard about and I know about, or trying to get people to all see things the same way. And I mean, maybe say something about the complexities.
You don't want people to see everything the same way. I mean, you actually want to embrace the conflict. You don't want to shun it. I mean, I'm like, people think that this project is actually, at least from a certain scale, that it seems sort of kumbaya, like, oh, look at, you know, people are getting along and blah blah. But on a much closer observation, you can see that that's not necessarily the case, and it can't be the case because there's there's many, many, many layers of unsatiated desires within this community, in which you can see the fragments of, where something was started and it wasn't completed. You have folks who are stakeholders who no longer live on the block, but they still, by extension, feel a proprietary ownership of not only just the towers and the park, but also the homes which surround it. You have the constituents who live on the street, like Genaro or Rosa or Rosario, or their children, Elizabeth, and who have a different level of investment. You have the Watchtowers Art Center, who has a very different concern in a way, because they're part of the Department of Cultural Affairs and they have to deal with the issues that are related to the campus. And all of these things are operating within a very complex, and it's not a well-tuned machine. So like things are bumping against each other often because there's not enough resources.
Right.
There's many, many different perspectives that are operating at the same time. Generally, communication between these different constituencies is not great. And there's a general and concern about outsiders and what they're, why are you here? What are you doing? What are you for? Because, I mean, and that's based on a real history, like that. The history of exploitation and people being taken advantage of is real and legitimate. And it's something that we as an organization have considered these things to be obstacles, but that they're obstacles that can become opportunities. Because these are the obstacles which actually maintain the status quo. When you start to look at the incredible amount of money, knowledge, time, and goodwill that you have to collect just to try to turn like informal architecture into permitted architecture, I mean, it's tremendous. I mean, it could break the budget of most organizations. But then you realize that it's those realities which maintain the status quo. This is why certain economies stay the way they are, where certain neighborhoods stay poor and other ones do not. So instead of running away from that, you try to figure out, like, what's the strategy to get behind it? Like, can you get under it? Is there a way of, like, turning it? Because if you can do that, if you could fix that problem, then you really have done something, But and at the risk of saying too much, I do feel as though that the artist is particularly suited to this kind of problem because of the interdisciplinary way in which we tend to look at issues or at problems, and to try to resolve them in a particular kind of way.
I think about the history of art, and I think in ancient civilizations and earlier times, top leaders, kings, queens, whoever, would often turn to artists for issues of major importance because of that creative energy. And it seems like our world's gotten extremely professionalized, where we've lost that kind of creative looseness. I'm interested, Mario, about how you approach the problem in that sense of the creative energy.
Well, I think that you're that's an interesting way to kind of segue what I wanted to talk about, because thinking about like what Edgar just said in relationship to like how an artist approaches things, not necessarily a kind of playing chicken with the problem and going head on, but like being able to work a kind of obtuse angles and how to approach things from the top or the bottom or underneath, so to speak. And I was thinking about the Belmont Ruins project, which was organized by Bob Sane, who was running the LACMA lab projects here at the museum. And that whole project in the museum was about getting artists to look at works of art, in this instance, that are inside this permanent collection, and then reinterpret them, re-examine them, and then somehow represent them to the art-going audience in a way that would somehow give them a new kind of contextualization, a new revitalization, a new circumstance. And I think that was one of the problems that I think when I kind of approached that project, I really wanted to kind of address, like, how do we re-examine something that has been around for a long time? And I think that that's what Edgar's trying to speak to when he's talking about, like, the kind of legalities of certain things that we have to try to kind of figure out, or the language around certain things that we have to figure out. And then as artists, just culturally and in the society, in our society, how we have to figure out a niche for ourselves to kind of exist in and kind of perch on and kind of observe from. But at the same time, like, our key function as artists is to observe, but then to move past just this point of observation, but then to actually implement something, to actually produce something or make something. And I think that is what our training as artists gives us, in terms of like the assurance to take these kind of risks and to examine possibilities that somebody that is trained as an engineer, where he's really dealing with the logistics of, this thing will collapse if we don't put this rebar in it or whatever, to where artists aren't necessarily bound to those types of realities, so to speak. Right. At the end of the day, we are, but we're not going to start from there. We're not going to start from like what's going to hold us back. We have to start from like what's going to be the possibility to take us forward, and then we deal with the ramifications of those actions that we take to try to make. So we're kind of an offensive. We're not offensive, but we're on the offensive teams as opposed to like a defensive team. Because a defensive team is about holding the ball, and offense is about getting the ball as far down, passing it as far down as possible. And I think artists are all about letting the ball go and seeing how far we could kind of chuck it forward. And we fail miserably a lot of times, but sometimes the other guy catches it, the other person catches it, and you get somewhere. Right. But so I think the realities that we kind of deal with are about this kind of possibilities first, and the possibilities that could kind of happen from a problem, rather than the kind of dogmaticness of a problem.
Right. I mean, I do think this is something that's very important to me, what you're saying, both of you, and it's, you deal with it in the museum all the time, because people say, well, the museum's sort of an extracurricular. You don't really need the art. It's something you do after you learn to read and do basic things and have a job. But I also say that, I mean, it is life or death. We're all engaged in survival, right? Surviving life, surviving our circumstances, and it is something that I think we can't do anything without power of imagination. And I do believe that is part of what I see you involved in, with all the problems and failures that come from this kind of artistic practice, that it's somehow that there's this relationship between survival and imagination. It's not just, I don't know if that's fair, but...
Well, a lot of guys that grew up are in federal prison because they didn't have the budget to reach their imagination. But so as an artist, I get to play within these parameters of different types of institutions and different types of budgets to support my imagination. Thank God.
I mean, Ed, what would it cost to build the watchtowers today? What would it cost? And then how much for the insurance?
Well, you can't, because you can't do that anymore.
Yeah. And that was, one of the things about, and Ed had made this great documentary about Simon Rodia.
Beautiful.
And one of the extras that he put in there was this interview that Buckminster Fuller had done when he was talking about the towers. And he was saying that it's impossible to be able to realize something on that scale today. Just the conditions aren't there for the everyday man or the everyday woman or the everyday person to be able to realize something on that scale, just because the cost would be so great. Maybe you can go out in the desert and do it where you don't have to deal with like code violations and insurance and things like that. But maybe the same problems would exist there too. But one of the inspirations that the towers holds for me is less of the towers themselves as a monument, but more about the understanding of the process which created it in the first place. Like one of my favorite anecdotes is the one where Charles Mingus is quoted as saying that it wasn't uncommon to walk past the towers one day and to see a 2-story tower up and then to be down the next day. And I said, for something that seemed as like as permanent as rebar and cement, to me, was as malleable as clay to him. So like these things were going up and they were going down, and he didn't have a master plan as to how it would go. He just knew that he wanted to build something great. And if you look at that documentary that they show at the Watchtowers Art Center, you can see that that site was really a work in progress. You know, he had his boxes of stuff, his material. It was really a gigantic construction site for more than 30 years. It's difficult to see that now, though, because it's so perfectly preserved. And I say that with a wink about the preservation, but that it's difficult to sort of see that process. But I'm inspired by this idea that the person with, you know, with not even a high school education, with that imagination that you were describing that is now too expensive to be able to perform today on that level, on that scale, was able to engineer something in a way which was so complex, full of polyhedrons and tetrahedrons and like this incredible foundation that I don't even know if people have really investigated all of the complex geometries in there, but it really is a monument to the human will, that thing. And our interest is not necessarily to do it as one individual, because as Rodiah said when he was introduced to Gaudi, he was like, well, did he build it by himself? Was that, you know, can we do it collectively, really embracing the moment of our time, which is, you know, the paradigm of the internet, which is about sharing, cooperation, collaboration, and can lead to collectivism. This paradigm is something which we're trying to embrace, in which people are giving their time and giving their support, not necessarily because they're looking for something in return, but because the value that they get in return is the experience itself of giving.